too, of welcome to our brothers and sisters of Paulist Catholics who are here with us. Wherever your Sunday morning takes you, wherever that journey leads you, we just want you to know that you are always welcome here. And may you find this as a place of welcome and refuge. Well, we've been waving the branches and singing the songs in the spirit of hailing a conquering king. And I would love to say that I entered this morning as a sort of a performative act, but that's not the case. In fact, I just forgot to print out the last page of my sermon, and so Thomas is bringing that to me, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, Debbie, for grabbing that. Thomas. Thank you. As we wave the branches and as we process in, certainly we together today proclaim some 2,000 years since the coming of a conquering king. But what I hope we recognize today is that this king is not conquering per se at all. And many of the constructs or imaginations that we have of king or kingdom or kingship really don't fit with what's happening today either. And so I hope that in a sense we can together redefine power. Redefine it in a way that I believe Jesus sort of leads us into seeing. What Rini read this morning and that which we celebrate today on Palm Sunday represents the climax of Jesus' conflict. His conflict with Rome and his conflict with the religious hierarchy. Now, if you were to ask any biblical scholar, why did Jesus die? They would point to the unfolding of these events and the following events as the groundwork and cause for his death. Jesus' statement, Jesus' entry is certainly a statement of power, and one of authority, one that we should not miss. Jesus is proclaimed a conquering hero under the nose of Rome. He enters the temple, he turns over the money changers, upset, saying, "How dare you turn my father's house how dare you turn my father's house into a den of thieves when it is a house of prayer." He goes on, if you read the continuation of Matthew chapter 22, to chastise the religious elite, and by doing so destabilizes the fragile social order by suggesting a God higher than Caesar. We'll follow Jesus' journey this coming week as we celebrate Holy Week. As we come into Maundy Thursday and Good Friday, we'll walk and journey with Jesus. And I pray that our affection for him grows. And as it does, our affection grows for one another and for ourselves. Now, it's not hard to miss that these are power moves that Jesus is making that undoubtedly land him in conflict, in hot water with Rome and the religious authorities. But make no mistake that Jesus does not shirk his power. He does not eschew his authority or shrink his voice to accommodate the establishing religious or social traditions or establishment. In fact, he's quite bold with his voice. Now, we'll later consider how he challenges that which gives one authority, but for now, let us just acknowledge that Jesus does anything but hide his voice, hide his opinion, or hide his power. I encounter many good people who seem to shirk their power and shrink from their voice. And often because they believe it to be the Christian thing to do. A friend of mine who I've worked with in the past for some time started a new job several years ago at a large hospital out of state. At the start of her job, she noted that she wanted to observe and learn And so she kept many of her opinions or thoughts to herself. But though a year or so into her work, she learned the territories and the perspectives, and at a time when she thought she should be offering her opinion or insight, she was doing the exact opposite, particularly around her male counterparts. Instead of offering her opinion, she would accommodate the establishment. Instead of suggesting a solution or an attempt or a way to approach some problem, she would rather just keep the peace and make everyone else around her feel comfortable. She found herself being polite, not wanting to make a scene, trying not to speak up too much. Instead of speaking up about what she saw as possible areas of improvement, she said to me, and I quote, "I found myself tiptoeing around the egos of everyone else as opposed to simply stating what I believe to be true, particularly the male egos in the room." Meekness is a virtue. Humility and servanthood are virtues, but none of these equate to subservience. None of these equate to silence in the face of authority or the establishment. To quote one of my favorite singer-songwriters, and if you're paying attention, I'm going to ask if anyone knows who wrote and sang this line. "Never be so polite that you forget your power." She goes on to sing, "Never be," Sam knows it. Who is it, Sam?
Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift. Well done. I love that line. I love that line. I'm a Swiftie. And we would do well not to lose our power simply for politeness or to accommodate. Jesus does not eschew or shirk his power as he enters into Jerusalem. A British social scientist, Michael Marmot, conducted a survey in the 1970s to understand the connection between workplace environments and one's physical health. Now, at the time, it was a pretty novel idea to think that our environment could somehow impact our physical well-being and symptoms. And I believe his findings then, some 50 years ago, still speak to us and have something to offer us today. Wanting to discern whether there was a link between one's vocation and one's health, Michael needed to first isolate the millions of variables that distinguish workplaces and types of careers and roles. He acknowledged that a nurse probably faces very different problems or issues than that of an electrician. And so finding a place with, he decided to focus on a single entity in British society, British civil servants, aka the British government. Now, British civil servants at the time worked in offices running along Whitehall Street. They worked similar hours, they sat about the same amount of time, they shared similar conditions at work, with also the stability of retirement and a secure paycheck. The difference in Michael's first test was whether any difference would be made according to their level of status, or even their work expectations in the civil service. Now, initially, they hypothesized that the higher level of stress and the higher level of expectation would lead, in fact, to higher incidence of medical issues. Such maladies as high blood pressure, heart attacks, diabetes, etc. Now, after conducting interviews and researching the medical history of some 18,000 British civil servants, what Michael and other researchers discovered was the exact opposite of their hypothesis. That is, if you were to work in a lower level status with fewer expectations and fewer responsibility, still with retirement, a decent place to live, and a secure paycheck, you were 4 times more likely to have a heart attack than if you actually had status and say and respect within your work. Something about their job, what the employees said, needing to turn it off, was physically making them sick. Drilling down even further, Michael isolated the participants then to those on the same status rung of the civil servant. Among these workers, variables were almost constant. They were paid the same, worked in the same location, were paid about the same, and had similar lifestyles, both inside and outside of work. The only difference was the amount of control or voice that they had within their work. What came shining through was that those with more control, more voice, more capacity, more power to affect change had higher levels of health, higher levels of reported satisfaction, higher levels of well-being. At the conclusion of Michael's study, he wrote this, which I want you to hear today. Disempowerment is at the heart of poor health. Jesus does not ask us to keep our voices down, to maintain the status quo, to accommodate the ego. He does nothing of the sort. In fact, silence in this instance is not a virtue, and powerless is not morality. As I've noted, Jesus' entry has many parallels with the establishment power and the shape of contemporary ideas of authority for a first century Greco-Roman society. When we look carefully, however, what Jesus does is he actually turns some of those cultural norms on their head and imbues them not with authority above, but authority within. In doing so, I believe he invites us to deconstruct our own ways that we derive our power and our voice and our authority. Not to silence them, but to ask, where does it come from? In Matthew 21, we encounter the conquering hero motif. The hero's power as Jesus enters Jerusalem is derived principally, as one writer and scholar states, from battle. The ritual of ceremonial entry displayed, and I'm quoting here, central Roman values: imperial greatness, supremacy over one's enemies, military domination and conquest, power over as the basis of societal interactions, as well as violence, submission, enslavement, and the subjugation of one's enemy. Jesus' entry may take its cues from some of that Roman imperial conquest, but his message is hardly one of power or subjugation or oppression, but rather one of healing, and a message for those who are poor and outside the establishment, a message of liberation. So how does Jesus subvert these claims to power as he's entering with the form and shape of first century Greco-Roman power? First, Jesus enters on a donkey, a beast of burden. Jesus is not heralded by any person of significance. If you think there's no one in the city who's actually coming out to meet Jesus and welcome him. Rather, it's the crowds, the rural folk, the onlookers who have come to express him as king. He enters Jerusalem not as a conqueror, ultimately, but as one who would give himself as a victim of Rome's oppressive apparatus. Silence, or you will be silenced. He is heralded by the crowd not for his acts of violence or military might, but by his acts of healing, and by his touch, and by his gentleness. He has conquered no territory. He has subjugated no people. In fact, he's taught that your neighbor extends beyond tribe or country or any delineation that we might like to project. Power, in Jesus' sense, is not derived from might, prestige, or status, but from a deep, abiding connection with God and a life of healing and a life of offering and a life of love. These are the powers that begin to speak through Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. His entry carries, of course, modern symbols, or at that time, first century modern symbols of power and status. But in so doing, he rejects every single one by saying, my power comes from God. And my power comes from love. As a side note, and perhaps not too far aside, what troubles me is how the 21st century Protestant culture has seemed to prefer Roman forms of dominion rather than the message of healing and neighbor and kinship and relationship and connection. Even dominant strands of Christianity have fallen in love with increasing our territory, silencing women, and disassociating from anyone who does not agree. And lest you think that's an old habit, just look at what happened in the Southern Baptist Convention this week. We've inherited a dominant Christian culture that wants its men to be armed, its women to be pure, and Mother Earth to be subdued. This has nothing to do with the good news of Jesus. Amen. Or the power of Jesus. Still, we find ourselves lost and grabbing for power that's already been hollowed out by Jesus' message of love. So, if you'd permit me, may I ask you a series of questions? What gives you power? If you don't have power and you're looking for it, how are you seeking to find it? And perhaps you've found a voice of authority, but it's not your voice. It's a voice that society values, but it's not really your voice. And for those who have found power or status, or at least a voice within their workplace, or in their friendships, or in their religious associations, how will you use it? I recall during my time as a chaplain working with one of the first employees of Nationwide Insurance, what was at the time called Farm Bureau Mutual. He started sometime in the early 1940s as the company was expanding. Raising through the ranks, he became eventually the senior vice president of the company. He held that post for the remainder of his life. My first visit was actually at his house, where as soon as I walked in, I could see the accolades and the myriad of expressions and awards that he had received through his work and time. Later, as his care became too much to live at home, I would visit him in a skilled nursing center. And as we became friends, I asked him, what did you really value most about your work? And I will never forget what he said. He said, Adam, I was in charge of making sure that everyone, and at that time, I mean really every single employee at Nationwide, was paid on time. Making sure families had what they needed was more important to me than anything else. More important than status, more important than position or role. His work was to pay the families on time. What gives us power may be very different from what our society recognizes as the powerful. What gave Jesus power was not might or position, but his commitment to healing and proclaiming the good news of God to liberate all. If you're the type of person who may be too polite to really have your power, or perhaps you're just trying to accommodate the status quo or the egos around you and trying just to keep the peace, please hear this. We need your voice. We need you to speak up. We, not just this church, but we as a society, need to hear from you. And if you're in charge of sectors within your industry, may I ask you to help find voice for others. Use your position to make space for others, that that energy of life and that well-being is reestablished and breathed into people who may feel like they have to turn it off when they go to work. And you all know what I mean by turn it off. And I recognize that even as I stand here, a white, educated, cisgendered male, that I need to make space for others to speak. That's a big part of the reason why we have other voices in our pulpit, to share from their perspective and their story and their lives. I do not hold the keys to this place, nor does any single person here. This is your house. This is God's house. This is a house of prayer, and you are welcome here. Amen. Would you just join me in a brief time of silence as we consider the